Number 1. Rex Heuermann. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach case felt like one of those stories that would never truly end. Bodies discovered along a remote stretch of Long Island shoreline. Years of fear, years of rumors, years of families waiting for answers. And then, in July 2023, the name investigators announced was not a drifter, not a known violent offender, not someone living on the margins. It was Rex Heuermann, a New York architect from Massapequa Park, a married father, a man who, at least on the surface, seemed to live an ordinary suburban life. That contrast is what made the arrest land so hard. Imagine hearing that one of the most notorious cold cases in New York history had suddenly narrowed to someone who had been moving through everyday life the entire time. Before his arrest, Heuermann was known publicly as an architect who worked in Manhattan and lived on Long Island, not far from the very region that had become synonymous with the case. Investigators said he had lived for decades across the bay from where several victims' remains were found. To outsiders, there was little about his public image that suggested he would become the central figure in such a massive investigation. And that is part of what kept drawing people back into the story. Cases like this disturb people not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the possibility that someone can appear settled, routine, even forgettable, while carrying secrets that stretch back years. The core of the case goes back to the disappearances and deaths of multiple women whose remains were found in the Gilgo Beach area in 2010 and 2011. In July 2023, prosecutors charged Heuermann in the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, and identified him as the prime suspect in the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Then, the case kept expanding. In January 2024, he was charged in Brainerd Barnes' death. In June 2024, prosecutors added charges tied to Jessica, Taylor, and Sandra Castilla. In December 2024, he was also charged in the death of Valerie Mack. By that point, the accusations against him stretched from 1993 to 2010, turning what had once looked like a cluster of killings into an alleged pattern spanning decades. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty. What made the investigation so gripping was how methodical the breakthrough appeared to be. Authorities said they revisited old evidence, re-examined phone records, and followed a trail that included burner phone activity linked to several victims. Prosecutors also pointed to vehicle information connected to witness descriptions and to cell site data that helped narrow their focus. Then came the detail that pushed the case into headlines everywhere. Investigators recovered a discarded pizza crust and used DNA from it as part of the evidence tying Heuermann to the case. Later, prosecutors said a cheek swab taken after his arrest matched that earlier DNA result, reinforcing their position. Imagine being investigators on a case that had haunted Long Island for years, and realizing the break might come not from a confession or a dramatic witness, but from something as small and ordinary as trash left behind in public. And yet, even after the arrest, the story did not become simple. In cases like this, an arrest is not the end of the mystery. It is the beginning of a new one. Can prosecutors prove it in court? Heuermann's defense has pushed back hard, challenging aspects of the forensic evidence and seeking to separate the charges into multiple trials rather than one sweeping proceeding. Prosecutors argued the killings showed overlapping patterns and should be tried together. In September 2025, a judge rejected the request to split the case, allowing the prosecution to move forward in a single trial structure. That mattered because it suggested the court accepted the idea that the allegations were connected strongly enough to be heard as one broader narrative. The legal battle has also become a test of modern forensic strategy. One of the important disputes has centered on advanced DNA analysis used in the case. Prosecutors have treated that science as a major pillar of their evidence. The defense, on the other hand, has argued that some of those methods need more scrutiny. That tension gives the case another layer. It is not only about whether jurors believe prosecutors have the right man, but also about how much weight emerging forensic tools should carry in a courtroom. In a case built across many years, many victims, and many forms of evidence, every piece matters. As of early 2026, Heuermann remains jailed without bail, has pleaded not guilty, and is scheduled to stand trial after Labor Day in September 2026. He is charged in 7 killings, and prosecutors have continued to file detailed motions laying out what they say is a long-running pattern of behavior. But legally, that is where the case stands. Charged, not convicted. That distinction matters. The allegations are massive, the public attention is intense, and the families have waited a very long time. But the final judgment still belongs to the court. What lingers most in the Rex Heuermann case is not just the scale of it, but the length of time. Years passed. Families kept living with uncertainty. Investigators kept chasing fragments. And then the person accused turned out to be someone who, on paper, looked painfully ordinary. That may be the most unsettling detail of all. Not the dramatic kind, not the cinematic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that makes people wonder how many secrets can sit behind the front door of a normal house, on a normal street, for years before anyone finally puts the pieces together. Number 2, Robert Durst. For years, Robert Durst seemed to exist in that rare space where wealth, mystery, and suspicion all blurred together. He was the heir to one of New York's best-known real estate families, a man with money, connections, and a name. People recognized, but behind that polished label was a story that kept circling back to the same chilling question. Why did people close to him keep disappearing or turning up dead? By the time the public fully caught up, the case no longer felt like one crime. It felt like a long shadow stretching across decades. Imagine hearing about a man whose life looked like a Manhattan success story on paper, only to realize it was slowly becoming one of the strangest criminal sagas in modern America. Before he became a courtroom fixture and documentary subject, Durst was known as the eldest son of Seymour Durst, the New York developer behind the Durst organization. He grew up around privilege, business, and the expectations that come with a powerful family name. On the outside, he was part of a world of luxury buildings, inherited influence, and quiet elite circles. But even early on, there were signs that his life did not fit neatly into that image. Over time, he became better known not for real estate, but for the strange tragedies that seemed to follow him. First, the disappearance of his wife, Kathleen McCormick Durst, in 1982, then the killing of his close friend Susan Berman in 2000, and later, the death of his neighbor Morris Black in Texas in 2001. He was acquitted in Black's case, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. The part of the story that haunted New York the longest was Kathleen, often called Kathy. She vanished in January 1982 after what prosecutors would later describe as a troubled marriage. Her body was never found. For decades, that absence hung over everything. Then came Susan Berman, Durst's longtime confidant. Prosecutors said she had helped provide a false alibi after Kathy disappeared, and, years later, became a liability because she was preparing to speak with police. In December 2000, Berman was found dead in her Beverly Hills home. That case would become the one prosecutors could finally bring to trial, and their theory was simple but powerful. Berman knew too much about what happened in 1982. What made the Durst case so gripping was the slow, relentless way it built. This was not one shocking night followed by a quick arrest. It was years of fragments, contradictions, and people wondering how someone under so much suspicion could keep slipping through. Then the story took a modern turn. Durst became the subject of HBO's The Jinx, a documentary that pulled the old cases back into public view. In 2015, just before the final episode aired, he was arrested in New Orleans in connection with Susan Berman's death. The series had reignited public scrutiny, but prosecutors still had to do the hard work in court. A documentary can make people suspect. A jury has to decide. At trial in Los Angeles, prosecutors argued that Durst killed Berman to keep her from revealing her role in covering up Kathy's disappearance. They leaned on a broad mosaic of evidence, his ties to Berman, statements he had made over the years, and the prosecution's claim that the older New York disappearance supplied the motive for the later California killing. The defense attacked that theory from every angle. Durst's lawyers said there was no direct physical evidence proving he killed Berman and argued that key witnesses could not be trusted. Durst himself testified, denied killing Berman, and gave explanations that prosecutors said were full of shifting stories and lies. Imagine sitting on that jury and trying to sort through decades of suspicion, half explanations, and a defendant whose life already sounded almost unreal. On September 17, 2021, the jury found Robert Durst guilty of first-degree murder in Susan Berman's death. It was the first homicide conviction in a saga that had stretched across nearly 40 years. Less than a month later, on October 14th, a judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many people following the case, it felt like a late answer to years of public doubt. But the legal fallout did not stop there. On October 19, 2021, prosecutors in Westchester County filed a complaint accusing him in the 1982 death of Kathy Durst, and on November 1st, a grand jury indicted him for second-degree murder. In other words, just after California secured a conviction, New York moved to finally charge the case that had haunted his name the longest. And yet, even that ending refused to stay simple. Durst was in poor health during and after the California trial. On January 10, 2022, he died at age 78 while serving that life sentence. Because his appeal in the Berman case was still pending, his conviction was later vacated under a legal rule that can erase a conviction when a defendant dies before the appeal is completed. That technical outcome did not reopen the facts of the case, but it did leave the record in a strange place, sentenced, then dead, with the conviction no longer standing in the same formal way. Meanwhile, the New York case over Kathy's death never reached trial. He had been indicted, but with his death, that prosecution ended too. That is what makes Robert Durst's story linger. It is not only about one verdict or one courtroom win. It is about how wealth, delay, and uncertainty can stretch a case across generations. Families waited decades. Investigators kept reopening doors that never seemed to stay closed. And in the end, even when the justice system finally caught up in one case, time still interrupted the full reckoning. Maybe that is the most unsettling part. Not that the story was unbelievable, but that it remained unresolved for so long that people almost got used to the mystery. Then suddenly, after all those years, the mystery started answering back. Number 3, Yoselin Ortega. She was supposed to be the safe person in the room, the familiar face, the one a family trusted with the most important part of their lives. And that is exactly why the Yoselin Ortega case hit New York with such force. In stories like this, the fear does not begin with a stranger in the shadows. It begins inside a home, in the middle of an ordinary day, with someone who had already been welcomed in. Imagine dropping your children off with the person who had cared for them again and again, never knowing that by evening, everything about your life would be divided into before and after. Before the crime, Ortega was known as the Krim family's nanny on Manhattan's Upper West Side. She had worked for the family for nearly 2 years and had become part of the routine of daily life, helping care for 3 young children, Lucia, known as Lulu, Leo, and their younger sister. That routine matters because trust in a case like this does not appear overnight. It is built through repetition, school runs, meals, errands, quiet afternoons. To the outside world, it looked like a familiar arrangement in a busy city. Professional parents, young children, and a caregiver who had become deeply embedded in the household. Nothing about that image suggested the story was moving toward one of the most heartbreaking cases New York had seen in years. On October 25th, 2012, that ordinary routine broke apart. Prosecutors said Ortega waited until she was alone with 6-year-old Lucia and 2-year-old Leo inside the family's apartment. Their mother, Marina Krim, had taken the youngest child out and expected the afternoon to continue normally. But when Ortega failed to appear for Lucia's dance class, Marina returned home with growing concern. What she walked into would later become one of the most haunting parts of the trial. She found her 2 children dead in the bathroom and Ortega nearby, injuring herself with a knife. It was the kind of moment that seems impossible even as it is happening. Imagine opening your own front door and realizing within seconds that the world you knew is gone. The shock of the crime spread immediately because it seemed so completely at odds with the setting. This was not a hidden location or a chaotic late-night scene. It was a family apartment in one of the most recognizable parts of Manhattan in broad daylight, involving children who had done nothing except trust the adult caring for them. Prosecutors later argued that Ortega had planned the attack, saying she waited until she was alone with the children and used knives from the family's kitchen. The defense would present a very different explanation. But even in those first hours, one central fact was already clear. The person entrusted to protect the children was now accused of killing them. As the investigation moved forward, the case became not only about what happened, but why. Ortega did not deny that she had killed the children. Instead, the coming legal fight centered on her mental state. That distinction shaped everything. Investigators and prosecutors treated the case as an intentional act, while the defense argued that Ortega had been in the grip of severe mental illness. At trial, her lawyers said she experienced hallucinations and should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Prosecutors pushed back, arguing that the evidence showed thought, sequence, and awareness rather than legal insanity. That clash gave the case its central tension, not whether she caused the deaths, but whether she could be held fully criminally responsible for them. When the trial began in 2018, the testimony was painful and closely followed. Marina Krim took the stand and described returning home to the scene, calling it a nightmare. Prosecutors argued Ortega had acted with intent and presented the killings as a deliberate choice. The defense urged jurors to see the case through the lens of mental collapse. In a courtroom, that kind of divide can be especially difficult. Jurors are asked to look at the same facts and answer a narrower, harder question. Did the defendant understand what she was doing and that it was wrong? In Ortega's case, the jury ultimately answered yes. On April 18, 2018, she was convicted after jurors rejected the insanity defense. The legal process did not fully end there. Ortega had originally been convicted of 2 counts each of first-degree and second-degree murder. In 2022, New York's appellate division dismissed the second-degree counts as inclusory concurrent counts, but otherwise affirmed the judgment and sentence of life without parole. Then, in 2023, New York's highest court reviewed another major issue: whether autopsy reports had been introduced through a medical witness who had not performed the autopsies, violating Ortega's confrontation rights. The Court of Appeals agreed there had been a constitutional error, but ruled that the error was harmless and allowed the convictions to stand. That meant the core outcome of the case did not change. Even after years of appeals, the verdict remained in place. At sentencing on May 14, 2018, Judge Gregory Caro imposed the maximum punishment available: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ortega addressed the court and apologized, but the sentence made clear how the justice system had resolved the case. As of the latest appellate rulings, she remains convicted of first-degree murder and is serving life without parole. There is no release date waiting at the end of that sentence. What makes the Yoselin Ortega case linger is not only the horror of the crime, but the setting of it: a family home, a weekday afternoon, a trusted caregiver. The details force people into an uncomfortable thought. Sometimes the most devastating breaches of trust do not come from far away. They come from the person already standing in the kitchen, already holding the keys, already woven into daily life. And maybe that is why this case still feels so unsettling. It shattered one of the most basic assumptions a parent can have: that the person helping care for your children is helping keep them safe. Number 4. Maxim Gelman. It started with an argument in a Brooklyn home, the kind of private, messy moment that usually ends with slammed doors and silence. Instead, it turned into a 28-hour rampage that cut across Brooklyn and Manhattan, leaving New Yorkers trying to understand how one man could move through the city, causing so much chaos in so little time. That is what makes the Maxim Gelman case so unsettling. Imagine waking up to an ordinary winter day in New York and, by nightfall, hearing that a single suspect had left a trail of violence stretching from neighborhood streets to a subway car near Midtown. Before February 2011, Gelman was not a public figure or a name known across the city. He was a 24-year-old Brooklyn man, born in Ukraine, living a life that, from the outside, did not suggest he was about to become the center of one of New York's most shocking one-day manhunts. But as investigators later pieced together the events, they found a story driven by personal grievances, anger, and a sense that he believed certain people had wronged him. That matters, because this was not a random burst that began in the street. It began in a domestic setting, then widened outward, pulling strangers into something they had no way to predict. In the early hours of February 11, 2011, prosecutors said Gelman fatally attacked his stepfather, Alexander Kuznetsov, inside the family home in Sheepshead Bay after an argument. From there, the violence escalated fast. Authorities said he took a vehicle and fled, then ran over a crossing guard, badly injuring her. But the spree did not stop there. Investigators said he later targeted people he knew, including 20-year-old Yelena Bulchenko. and her mother, Anna Bolchenko, both of whom were killed in Brooklyn. At that point, the case was no longer a local domestic tragedy. It had become a citywide emergency. Imagine police officers realizing that the suspect was mobile, armed, and moving through New York at random intervals, with no clear sign of where he would surface next. Then came another layer of fear. The victims were no longer only people from his personal life. Authorities said Gelman carjacked a driver, Sheldon Pottinger, after stabbing him in the hand, stole his vehicle, and kept moving. He also struck and killed a pedestrian, 56-year-old Isaac Jourdain, with a stolen car in Manhattan. That shift changed the emotional weight of the case. Once strangers begin dying, the story feels different. Suddenly, anyone crossing the street, anyone sitting in traffic, anyone on a train becomes part of the danger zone. The city had a suspect on the loose who seemed to be crossing from grievance to pure momentum. And that is when the tension truly peaked. The final chapter of the rampage unfolded on a subway train near Times Square on February 12th. By then, news of the suspect had spread widely enough that some people recognized his face. On a Manhattan-bound 3 train, Gelman approached Joseph Lozito, a passenger who had no connection to him at all, and attacked him with a knife. What happened next became one of the most talked about moments in the case. Lozito fought back and managed to wrestle Gelman to the ground, helping bring the spree to an end until officers moved in and arrested him. Imagine that moment from a passenger's point of view. A confined subway car, a wanted suspect, panic building, and one civilian realizing that if he did not act, the violence might continue. As investigators worked through the timeline, the case came into focus as one of the most intense short-duration manhunts New York had seen in years. The evidence was not subtle. There were multiple crime scenes, surviving victims, vehicle thefts, and direct witness accounts. The subway attack, in particular, gave prosecutors a living witness who could describe the end of the spree in detail. The question was never really whether police had the right suspect. The real question became how the legal system would process a case so broad, so public, and so emotionally charged. Gelman initially pleaded not guilty, but the legal process shifted as the evidence mounted. In November 2011, he pleaded guilty in Brooklyn to murder, attempted murder, robbery, and assault charges tied to the killings and attacks that happened across the city. Then, in January 2012, he also pleaded guilty in Manhattan to the attempted murder of Lozito in the subway attack. His lawyer said a psychiatrist had concluded Gelman could not successfully pursue an insanity defense, which removed one of the main possible paths his defense might have taken. That left the court facing a blunt reality. This was now largely about punishment, not uncertainty over what had happened. On January 18, 2012, a Brooklyn judge sentenced Gelman to 200 years in prison for the killings and related crimes from the spree. Reuters reported that during sentencing, he showed no real remorse, interrupting and shouting as victims' loved ones addressed the court. Then, on February 15, 2012, he received an additional 25-year sentence in Manhattan for the subway attack on Lozito to run after the earlier term. In practical terms, it meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison. There would be no realistic path back into society, no future hearing that might erase the weight of what happened over those 28 hours. As far as current status goes, Gelman remains a New York State prisoner serving what is effectively a life term. The case is closed in the legal sense, but it has never completely faded from memory because of how quickly it unfolded and how public the final moments became. New Yorkers still remember the randomness of it, the way the city seemed to shrink under the fear that he could surface anywhere next. A home in Brooklyn, a stolen car, a midtown street, a subway train. Each location made the story feel less contained and more impossible to escape. What lingers most about the Maxim Gelman case is the speed. Some true crime stories unfold over months, even years, giving people time to process each development. This one moved like a chain reaction. One act led to another, then another, until the city was chasing a moving threat in real time. And maybe that is why it still feels so disturbing. Not only because of what he did, but because of how quickly ordinary places turned into scenes of panic. A family kitchen, a Brooklyn street, a Manhattan crosswalk, a subway car. The whole story is a reminder of how fast normal life can collapse when one person decides that everyone else will be dragged into his rage. Number 5. Kevin Gavin. The building was supposed to feel safe. It was senior housing in Brooklyn, the kind of place where routines matter, where neighbors know each other, where the familiar face in the hallway is usually a comfort. But in the Kevin Gavin case, that familiarity became the most unsettling part of all, because when police finally made an arrest in January 2021, they did not accuse an outsider who had forced his way in. They accused a man who lived in the same building, knew many of the residents, and according to investigators, had earned their trust by doing errands and odd jobs for them. Imagine being an elderly tenant in that building and realizing the danger was not somewhere outside the front door. It may have been living just down the hall. Before his arrest, Kevin Gavin was described by authorities as a 66-year-old Brownsville resident who was familiar to many of the older women living at the Carter G. Woodson houses, a New York City housing authority complex for seniors in Brooklyn. Police said he helped some tenants with groceries, errands, and small jobs. That detail matters because in cases like this, access is everything. Trust creates opportunity. Prosecutors later alleged that Gavin used that access to target women who were elderly, vulnerable, and living alone. On the surface, he was not a stranger passing through. He was someone already folded into the rhythm of the building, and that is exactly what gave the case its disturbing edge. According to police and prosecutors, the killing stretched across more than 5 years. The first victim was 92-year-old Myrtle McKinney, who was found dead in November 2015. Then, in March 2019, 83-year-old Jacolia James was found dead in her apartment. For a time, those deaths sat heavily over the building, but without the kind of public breakthrough that would suddenly solve everything. Then came January 2021. A third woman, 78-year-old Juanita Caballero, was found dead in her apartment, and this time, investigators said the pieces finally began to lock together. What had looked like isolated tragedies inside one housing complex now appeared, in the eyes of police, to be a pattern. Imagine the fear inside that building. Once residents realized this might not be coincidence at all. It might be one person, returning again and again. The investigation gained momentum after the third killing. Police said forensic evidence and witness information helped connect Gavin to the murders. ABC reported that investigators had identified him as a suspect during the investigation into the second death, but did not have enough at that stage to tie him conclusively to all 3 cases. After the January 2021 killing, that changed. Authorities said the evidence now linked him across the timeline, turning suspicion into charges. This is often the point in a case where the story shifts. It is no longer just about unanswered deaths. It becomes about whether law enforcement can prove that the same man moved through the same building over years, leaving devastation behind him while neighbors kept living beside him. When prosecutors formally laid out the case, the allegations became even more chilling. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office said Gavin allegedly strangled or stabbed the 3 women, and that he had done odd jobs for them. Sometimes for money he claimed he was owed. In March 2021, he was arraigned on an indictment charging him with 1 count of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder. Prosecutors said the pattern showed a deliberate course of conduct against multiple victims over time, which is why the top count carried the possibility of life without parole if he were convicted. That legal framing matters because it shows how seriously the case was being treated, not as one sudden act, but as a sequence of killings allegedly carried out inside the same residential community. And that is where the legal story becomes more complicated than some of the earlier cases on your list. In several of those, the courtroom process ended in a clear conviction and sentence. Here, the most reliable current reporting shows that Gavin has been charged and held, but the case has moved slowly. In 2025, News 12 reported that the families of the 3 women were still waiting for the next step, with the case potentially heading either toward a trial or a plea deal later that year. In other words, as of the latest source I found, this is still an accused serial killing case, not a completed conviction story. That distinction matters, especially in a script like this. The allegations are grave, and prosecutors have described a brutal pattern, but the final judgment still has not been delivered in court. So the current status is this. Kevin Gavin was arrested in January 2021, indicted in March 2021, and has faced charges tied to the deaths of Myrtle McKinney, Jacolia James, and Juanita Caballero. Prosecutors said he should be held without bail, and he has faced the possibility of life without parole if convicted on the top charge. But based on the latest available reporting, the case had not yet ended in a verdict or formal sentencing. That leaves the families in the painful position of waiting, even years after the arrest, for the full legal reckoning to arrive. What makes the Kevin Gavin case linger is not only the age of the victims or the long span between the deaths. It is the setting. A senior housing building is supposed to be a place of routine and refuge, a place where small kindnesses matter. A man helping with errands should register as reassuring, not threatening. But this case turned those assumptions upside down. It forced residents and families to imagine something deeply uncomfortable, that trust itself may have been the opening. And maybe that is the most haunting part of all. Not simply that 3 elderly women died in the same building, but that the man accused of causing those deaths was, according to police, someone they already knew by name. Number 6, Jaquan Hamilton, Robert DeMaio, and Jacob Barroso. It looked at first like the kind of night thousands of people have in New York. Bars closing, music fading, people spilling onto the sidewalks of Hell's Kitchen. Laughing, unsteady, trying to get home. But hidden inside that ordinary nightlife rhythm, prosecutors said, was a trap. According to the case presented in Manhattan court, Jaquan Hamilton, Robert DeMaio, and Jacob Barroso were part of a scheme that turned late-night chance encounters into robberies, and in 2 cases, into deaths. That is what makes this story so disturbing. Imagine stepping out of a crowded club, thinking the night is winding down, not realizing someone nearby is studying exactly how vulnerable you are. By the time their names became public in a major way, this was no longer being treated as a string of isolated incidents. Investigators said the defendants were part of a wider robbery pattern centered around Manhattan nightlife, especially around venues in Hell's Kitchen. Prosecutors alleged that the group approached intoxicated men, leaving bars and clubs, acted friendly, and offered drugs laced with fentanyl to incapacitate them. Once the victims could no longer protect themselves, the defendants allegedly took phones, wallets, and access to financial apps, then drained money through digital transfers and purchases. The motive, prosecutors said, was simple: greed. But what made the case especially chilling was how modern and calculated it seemed. This was not only about stealing cash from a pocket, it was about using a person's phone as the key to their entire financial life. The 2 deaths that turned the case into national news were those of Julio Ramirez and John Umberger. Ramirez was a 25-year-old social worker. Umberger was a 33-year-old political consultant visiting New York from Washington, D.C. In both cases, relatives quickly suspected something was wrong, not only because of the sudden deaths, but because money began disappearing from the victims' accounts. Medical examiners later classified both deaths as homicides caused by drug-facilitated thefts, and lab tests found substances including fentanyl, cocaine, and lidocaine. Those findings gave investigators a crucial shift in perspective. These were no longer viewed as tragic overdoses in the ordinary sense. They were treated as deaths tied directly to a robbery scheme. Imagine being a family member already trying to process a sudden loss, then discovering someone had kept spending from your loved one's accounts after he could no longer respond. Prosecutors laid out the pattern in detail at trial. They said Hamilton, DeMaio, and Barroso waited outside nightclubs for people who were already intoxicated, then offered more drugs to push them further into helplessness. In one earlier surviving victim incident described by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, a victim was allegedly brought back to his hotel, rendered unconscious with fentanyl-laced drugs, and later woke up to find his phone in Brooklyn and unauthorized charges and transfers draining his money. In another, a victim woke to discover missing cards and purchases at high-end stores. Those surviving incidents mattered because they helped prosecutors show the jury that the deaths of Ramirez and Umberger were not freak accidents, but part of a repeated method. A slow pattern became a clear one. Approach: drug, isolate, rob, disappear. Then came the 2 fatal nights. Prosecutors said that on April 21st, 2022, the defendants targeted Ramirez outside the Ritz bar in Hell's Kitchen, gave him fentanyl-laced drugs, and later left him unresponsive in the back of a taxi at around 3:30 in the morning. He was transported to a hospital and pronounced dead. Authorities said money was then transferred from his financial accounts and spent on sneakers and clothing. A month later, on May 28, 2022, prosecutors said Hamilton and DeMaio targeted Umberger outside the QNYC, went back to his apartment building with him, gave him fentanyl-laced drugs, and left him motionless on his bed while they used his accounts to spend more money. That sequence is what gave the case its awful momentum. The alleged theft did not stop when the victims became helpless. Prosecutors said it continued while the victims were dying. The investigation brought together surveillance footage, digital money trails, phone evidence, and witness accounts. At the 2023 announcement of the indictment, officials said searches of a cell phone linked to Robert DeMaio recovered videos showing Hamilton and DeMaio inside Umberger's apartment, including footage in which Umberger appeared unconscious on the bed where he was later found dead. Those kinds of details changed the case from suspicion to something much harder to explain away. By April 2023, Hamilton, DeMaio, Barroso, and 2 others had been indicted on robbery and conspiracy charges, with Hamilton and DeMaio charged in both deaths and Barroso charged in Ramirez's death. At that point, the city was no longer asking whether there was a pattern. It was asking how many nights this had happened before anyone could stop it. The trial ended in February 2025 with a sweeping result. A jury found Hamilton, DeMaio, and Barroso guilty on all 24 counts, including murder, robbery, burglary, and conspiracy. All 3 were convicted in the death of Julio Ramirez, while Hamilton and DeMaio were also convicted in the death of John Umberger. For prosecutors, that verdict confirmed the case they had been building since 2022. This was not careless nightlife chaos, but an organized plan to exploit intoxicated people for money, even at deadly risk. For the families, it was the first full legal acknowledgement of what they had feared from the beginning. Then came sentencing. On May 21st, 2025, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announced that Hamilton and DeMaio were sentenced to 40 years to life in state prison, while Barroso received 20 years to life. The sentence reflected the different counts tied to each man, but the overall message was clear. The court treated this as a deadly conspiracy, not just robbery gone wrong. As of now, that is their status: convicted, sentenced, and facing decades behind bars before any chance of release. What lingers about this case is how contemporary it feels. The setting was familiar: nightlife, smartphones, money transfer apps, quick rides home, strangers who seemed friendly for just a little too long. The violence was not chaotic in the usual sense. Prosecutors described it as controlled, almost procedural: a greeting on the sidewalk, a drink or an offer, a phone unlocked, a transfer sent, and then a life gone. Maybe that is why this case stays with people. It turned ordinary city habits into vulnerabilities, and it showed how, in the space of a single night, trust and distraction can be enough for everything to change. Number 7. Ryan Lawrence. Some cases feel shocking because they are sudden. This one felt unbearable because, for nearly 2 days, people were still hoping. In February 2016, Central New York was gripped by the search for 21-month-old Maddox Lawrence, a little girl whose disappearance quickly became the kind of story that makes an entire community stop and pay attention. But as police searched, the focus kept returning to one person: her father, Ryan Lawrence. Imagine watching a case unfold in real time, hoping a toddler will be found alive, while investigators begin to suggest that the person who should have protected her may already know exactly where the story ends. Before the crime, Ryan Lawrence was a 24-year-old father from the Syracuse area. Public reporting at the time described a young family already carrying more than its share of hardship, including Maddox's earlier battle with retinoblastoma, a rare eye cancer she had survived. That detail stayed with people because it made her seem even more fragile and even more loved by the wider community that came to know her name. On the surface, this was not a story about a stranger stepping into a child's life. It was about a father, a daughter, and a family relationship that should have been defined by care. That contrast is what made the case hit so hard when the facts became clearer. The case began to unravel over the weekend of February 20th, 2016. Authorities said Lawrence took Maddox from the child's mother during a scheduled visit and then failed to return her. As concern turned into panic, police and prosecutors began piecing together his movements. According to the Onondaga County District Attorney, investigators came to believe that Lawrence had taken Maddox to Labrador Hollow Unique Area, a state-owned rural area on the Onondaga-Cortland County line, roughly 15 miles south of Syracuse. Prosecutors said it was likely there that he killed her before later returning to the city and leaving her body in water near Syracuse's inner harbor. Imagine the emotional swing in a case like that. First, the frantic hope of a missing child search, then the dawning realization that the search may already be a recovery effort. What made the case especially haunting was how quickly the search turned into a manhunt. Lawrence became the subject of a 2-day search before he was found and taken into custody. During those hours, every development seemed to narrow the possibilities. Police were no longer simply asking where Maddox might be. They were trying to understand whether Lawrence had already crossed a line that could never be undone. When investigators eventually recovered Maddox's body, the case shifted from a missing child emergency to a homicide prosecution. And the grief that had been building in public suddenly hardened into something much heavier. The waiting was over, but the answer was devastating. As the investigation moved forward, prosecutors also tried to explain the motive, though cases like this never really feel explainable. According to reporting at the time, District Attorney William Fitzpatrick said Lawrence had alluded to jealousy over the attention Maddox was receiving as a possible reason. Whether people accepted that explanation or not, it added a deeply unsettling layer to the story. It suggested that what should have been ordinary parental care had somehow turned into resentment. In court, that kind of detail mattered because it helped prosecutors frame the killing not as an accident or a sudden lapse, but as an intentional act. Even then, the case still carried the disturbing tension common in family crimes. Everyone understands what happened in legal terms, but the emotional logic remains almost impossible to process. The legal process, however, moved more quickly than many people expected. Instead of going to trial, Lawrence accepted a plea deal. In September 2016, he pleaded guilty to murdering Maddox, avoiding a full jury trial and sparing the family a prolonged courtroom battle over the details. Reports at the time said the plea would result in a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. That plea was important for 2 reasons. First, it removed uncertainty about whether prosecutors could secure a conviction. Second, it meant the court would not spend weeks litigating a case whose basic facts had already shocked the region. Sometimes a plea closes the legal file faster, but it does not, and make the story any easier to absorb. If anything, a guilty plea can make the reality feel more final, because there is no defense narrative left to soften the edges. At sentencing in November 2016, the court imposed the expected term, 25 years to life in prison. Local and national reports described a deeply emotional hearing, with family members addressing the court and Judge Anthony Alloy condemning the crime in stark terms. Lawrence apologized and took responsibility, but the sentence made clear that the court viewed this as a deliberate killing of a very young child, and that the punishment would reflect that. In practical terms, 25 years to life means he will spend decades in prison before even becoming eligible for parole. It is not a fixed release date. It is a life sentence with only a possible future review after the minimum term has been served. As for his current status, the most reliable reporting available from the case record and sentencing coverage shows that Ryan Lawrence remains a convicted killer serving that 25 years to life sentence in New York State custody. I did not find any authoritative source showing that his conviction or sentence has been overturned. So, the clearest verified status is this. He pleaded guilty in 2016, was sentenced the same year, and remains imprisoned under that sentence. That matters because in true crime storytelling, it is easy to let a case drift into rumor or assume later developments that are not actually documented. Here, the confirmed ending is grim but straightforward. What lingers about the Ryan Lawrence case is the gap between the public search and the private reality behind it. For a brief time, people were still imagining rescue, still hoping for the kind of ending these stories almost never get. But this case was never really about a mystery in the usual sense. It was about betrayal at the most intimate level a case can reach, a parent and a child. And maybe that is why it still feels so difficult to sit with. Not only because Maddox was so young, or because the community hoped so hard, but because the person accused and then convicted was the very person who should have made her safest. Number 8. Robert Neulander. From the outside, it looked like a terrible household accident. A respected Syracuse doctor called 911 in September 2012 and said his wife had fallen in the shower. But almost from the beginning, something about the scene refused to settle. Investigators, prosecutors, and eventually jurors would spend years asking the same question. Was Leslie Neulander's death really a tragic fall, or had the accident been staged? That is what makes the Robert Neulander case so gripping. Imagine standing in a quiet suburban home, hearing a husband calmly describe a bathroom accident, while the physical evidence around you starts whispering a very different story. Before the case exploded into public view, Robert Neulander was not just another local physician. He was a prominent OB/GYN in the Syracuse area, well known in the community, successful, respected, and, to many people, deeply established. Leslie Neulander, meanwhile, was remembered as a former nurse, a mother, and an active member of local charitable life. On paper, they looked like a settled couple with status, stability, and a long marriage behind them. And that is part of why the case landed so hard. Stories like this always hit differently when the people at the center seem anchored in ordinary prestige. It forces people to imagine that even the most polished public image can hide something far darker behind closed doors. Leslie Neulander died on September 17, 2012, inside the couple's home in DeWitt, near Syracuse. Robert Neulander told authorities she had slipped in the shower and suffered a fatal head injury. At first, that explanation was treated seriously, but prosecutors later argued that Leslie had not died in an accidental fall at all. They said Robert struck her in the head and then moved her body, to make it look like a shower accident. That allegation became the spine of the entire case. The defense maintained that Leslie's death was exactly what it first appeared to be, a terrible, unforeseeable accident. But once investigators started digging deeper, the image of a simple fall became harder and harder to maintain. What gave the investigation its momentum was the slow accumulation of contradictions. The medical examiner eventually changed the manner of death from accidental to homicide, a major turning point that transformed the case from suspicious death to murder prosecution. Prosecutors also leaned heavily on bloodstain analysis and scene reconstruction, arguing that the physical evidence pointed away from a spontaneous bathroom fall and toward a staged scene. Imagine being one of the detectives or forensic experts in that house, looking at what seems like an ordinary domestic tragedy, then realizing the room may have been arranged to tell a false story. In cases like this, there is rarely one dramatic breakthrough. It is usually a buildup of small problems that keep refusing to go away. The first trial ended in 2015 with a conviction. A jury found Robert Neulander guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence, and he was sentenced. For a moment, it looked as if the case had reached its conclusion. But then the story took a turn that made it even more unusual. In 2018, a New York appellate court reversed that conviction and ordered a new trial because of juror misconduct. That meant the case did not end with one dramatic verdict. Instead, it went back into uncertainty, reopening old wounds for Leslie's family, and putting prosecutors in the difficult position of trying the whole case again years after the death. That reversal is one of the reasons the Neulander case remains so widely discussed. Even after one jury had spoken, the legal system was not finished. When the second trial began in 2022, the stakes felt even higher. Prosecutors again argued that Robert Neulander killed Leslie and staged the bathroom scene to cover it up. The defense again pushed the accident theory. By then, nearly a decade had passed since Leslie's death, which gave the case a heavy, almost exhausted feeling. Yet the core issue had not changed at all. Jurors still had to decide whether they believed the prosecution's reconstruction of a staged killing or the defense's claim of an accidental fall. On March 17, 2022, the second jury found Neulander guilty again, this time once more convicting him of murder in the second degree. That second conviction mattered enormously. It suggested that even after the first verdict had been erased, a new jury looking at the same central story still reached the same conclusion. At sentencing in May 2022, Neulander received 20 years to life in prison, along with a concurrent term on the evidence tampering count. In practical terms, that meant he would spend at least 2 decades in prison, before becoming eligible for parole. The sentence also gave the case the kind of formal ending it had lacked for years. But even then, the legal fight was not completely over. Neulander continued to appeal, asking for a third trial or a lesser sentence. In November 2023, that appeal was denied, leaving the conviction in place. So, as of the latest reliable reporting, the current status is clear. Robert Neulander remains convicted in the 2012 killing of his wife and is serving a sentence of 20 years to life. What makes this case linger is the gap between appearance and conclusion. A respected doctor, a quiet home, a 911 call describing an accident. Nothing about the opening moments sounded like a murder case destined to last more than a decade. And yet, that is exactly what it became. Maybe that is why the Robert Neulander story still unsettles people. It is not only about the verdicts or the appeals, it is about how fragile the surface of normal life can be. One version of events said, Leslie slipped and fell. Another said, that scene was carefully arranged to hide a killing. And in the end, after years of courtroom battles, two separate juries decided which version they believed. Number 9, Jeffrey Johnson. It happened in one of the busiest places in New York, in broad daylight, just as people were heading into work. The Empire State Building is supposed to represent the city at its most iconic, crowded sidewalks. Tourists, office workers, the feeling that everything is moving at once. But on the morning of August 24th, 2012, that familiar rhythm shattered in seconds. Jeffrey Johnson, a former clothing designer who had been laid off the year before, approached a former co-worker outside the building and opened fire. Imagine standing on a Manhattan sidewalk during the morning rush and realizing that the danger is not hidden somewhere far away. It is right there, in the open, unfolding in front of hundreds of people. Before that morning, Johnson was not known as a public figure. He was described by authorities as a former employee of Hazan Imports, a women's accessories company located near the Empire State Building. Investigators said he had been laid off in 2011 and had a long-running workplace grievance involving 41-year-old Stephen Ercolino, the colleague he would later target. That background matters because this was not presented as a random attack or an act tied to terrorism. From the beginning, officials treated it as a workplace dispute that had been building for some time. In other words, what looked like a sudden burst of violence had roots in an older conflict that never really ended. According to police, the attack began at around 9:03 in the morning on the 33rd Street side of the Empire State Building. Johnson reportedly emerged from behind a vehicle, walked up to Ercolino, and fired a .45 caliber handgun at him. Reuters reported that Ercolino was killed outside the building, ending the personal dispute in the most public way possible. But the chaos did not end with that first victim. After the shooting, Johnson began walking away, carrying the gun in a briefcase as pedestrians screamed and scattered. Imagine the confusion in that moment. 1 second, it is a normal Manhattan morning. The next, people are running, ducking, pointing, trying to understand whether the danger is over or still moving toward them. What happened next is one of the reasons this case stayed in public memory. A construction worker who saw the shooting followed Johnson and alerted nearby police officers stationed near the Fifth Avenue entrance of the Empire State Building. When officers confronted him, officials said Johnson raised his weapon. 2 NYPD officers then opened fire, killing him on the spot. That ended the immediate threat, but it created another crisis almost instantly. In the exchange, 9 bystanders were wounded. A few days later, police said all 9 had in fact been struck either by police bullets or by fragments caused when those rounds ricocheted and broke apart. So even after the gunman was down, the story kept growing more unsettling. The attack had begun as a workplace killing, but it ended as a public emergency involving wounded civilians in one of the most crowded commercial zones in the country. The investigation moved quickly because, in many ways, there was little mystery about who had carried out the attack. Johnson died at the scene, there were multiple witnesses, and the confrontation happened in a heavily populated area full of cameras and police presence. The main questions were not about identity, but about motive, sequence, and the police response. Officials said Johnson had no significant criminal background that immediately explained the shooting, which made the workplace angle even more central. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the image that emerged was of a man who had carried resentment from his firing and then acted on it in a dramatic, fatal confrontation outside one of New York's most famous buildings. Because Johnson was killed by police at the scene, there was no trial, no defense case, and no long courtroom fight over guilt. That changes the structure of the story in an important way. In many true crime cases, the trial becomes the place where the narrative is tested. Here, the legal process mostly shifted toward post-incident review. Investigators examined the shooting itself, the officer's response, and how 9 bystanders came to be injured. Reuters later reported that NYPD officers had fired 16 rounds using hollow point bullets, and that 6 of the 9 injured bystanders were hit by shrapnel, while 3 were struck by bullets. So, while there was no prosecution of Johnson, there was still intense public scrutiny. The focus moved from proving who did it to understanding how one act of violence had spiraled into such a dangerous chain reaction in the middle of Manhattan. In terms of final legal status, Jeffrey Johnson died on August 24th, 2012, after being shot by responding NYPD officers. That means the case against him ended at the scene. There was no conviction to enter, no sentence to impose, and no appeal to follow. The surviving legal and public questions centered on the police shooting and the injuries to bystanders, not on Johnson's criminal liability, which was never going to be resolved in court because he did not survive the encounter. That makes this case different from many others on your list. The ending came immediately, but it did not bring anything close to closure. What lingers most about the Jeffrey Johnson case is how fast a personal grievance became a citywide shock. This was not a hidden crime scene or a secluded attack. It unfolded at the foot of one of the most recognizable buildings in the world, in front of commuters and tourists, at the exact hour when the sidewalks were fullest. And maybe that is why it still feels so disturbing. A dispute that may have simmered quietly for months or years suddenly exploded in the most public way possible. One man he blamed, one fatal sidewalk confrontation, then police gunfire, panic, and 9 more people caught in the aftermath. It is the kind of case that reminds you how little distance there can be between ordinary city life and total chaos. Number 10. Levi Aaron. He was the kind of person most families would never have noticed twice. A quiet man in Brooklyn, living an unremarkable life, moving through ordinary streets in an ordinary neighborhood. And that is part of what made the Levi Aaron case hit New York so hard in July 2011. Because the story did not begin in some hidden place, or with a stranger forcing his way into someone's life. It began with an 8-year-old boy named Levi Kletsky walking home in Borough Park, a route his parents had carefully prepared him to take on his own for the first time. Imagine the mix of pride and nervousness in a moment like that. A child is learning independence. A parent is trusting the world, just a little. And then, suddenly, that trust is gone. Before the crime, Aaron was publicly described as a Brooklyn hardware store clerk from the Kensington area, not someone known for a violent criminal record. Early reporting noted that he had no major prior history that would have made him stand out as an obvious threat. To neighbors and acquaintances, he came across as awkward and withdrawn rather than openly dangerous. And that contrast matters in a case like this. The most disturbing crimes often leave people asking not only how it happened, but how the person accused managed to blend so completely into normal life beforehand. In Aaron's case, that question hung over everything that followed. On July 11, 2011, Levi disappeared while walking home from day camp in Borough Park, a heavily Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn. His disappearance triggered an enormous search involving the NYPD and thousands of volunteers from the Orthodox community. For hours, the case carried the desperate rhythm of a missing child emergency. Flyers, frantic calls, neighbors searching block by block. Everyone hoping the boy had simply gotten lost and would be found safe. But behind that public effort, the case was already moving towards something far darker. Investigators would later determine that Aaron had encountered Levi, taken him away, and kept him with him as the search for the child expanded across the city. Imagine the terror of that contrast. While an entire neighborhood is racing to find one missing boy, the person who knows exactly where he is quietly watching it all unfold. The case broke open on July 13, 2011, when police traced Levi to Aaron's apartment in Kensington. There, investigators discovered evidence that turned a missing person case into one of the most devastating child-killing cases in New York memory. The city had been bracing for bad news, but this was worse than most people had imagined. The arrest came quickly after that discovery, and Aaron was taken into custody as the details began to spread. Even now, what stands out about this stage of the case is the speed of the emotional collapse. Public hope did not fade slowly. It ended all at once, the moment police found the trail leading into Aaron's home. As investigators and prosecutors built the case, the legal path became unusually direct. Aaron was indicted on multiple murder and kidnapping charges in 2011, exposing him to the possibility of life without parole. His lawyers raised mental health issues early, and the court ordered psychiatric evaluation, but he was ultimately found competent to stand trial. Then, in August 2012, rather than forcing the family through a full trial, Aaron pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. That plea mattered for several reasons. It avoided a long courtroom replay of the facts, it secured a conviction, and it gave the Kletsky family a measure of legal finality without the uncertainty of a jury trial. Sometimes a plea deal feels procedural. In this case, it felt like an attempt to spare a grieving family from reliving the entire nightmare in public. At sentencing on August 29, 2012, a Brooklyn judge imposed 40 years to life in prison, structured as 25 years to life on the murder count and 15 years to life on the kidnapping count. Reports at the time noted that the plea deal had spared Aaron the risk of a harsher outcome, including life without parole, but the sentence still meant he would spend decades in prison before even becoming eligible for parole. Legally, that was the court's final answer: convicted, sentenced, and removed from society for what was expected to be the rest of his life. The sentence also reflected the court's view that this was not a case of temporary confusion or partial responsibility. It was treated as a deliberate kidnapping and killing of a child. For years, that was where the story stood. Aaron remained in New York State custody, serving the 40 years to life sentence, with parole eligibility decades away. But there was one final development after your original list item. In December 2025, CBS New York reported that Aaron died at age 49 while still in custody after being taken to a hospital near Wenda Correctional Facility in Erie County. So his current status is no longer simply serving 40 years to life. As of now, he is dead, and the sentence ended in prison rather than with any future parole hearing. What makes the Levi Aaron case linger is not only the grief of it, but the setting. Borough Park is a place built on routine, family, and close community ties. A child walking home through familiar streets should have been one of the safest scenes imaginable. Instead, it became a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can fracture. Maybe that is why this case stayed with New York for so long. Not just because of the crime itself, but because it shattered one of the most basic assumptions any parent wants to believe: that a short walk home, in your own neighborhood, in the middle of the day, can still be trusted.